Hey everybody, this is Mr. Sumingo. Today's lesson we'll be learning about population dynamics. As you know, we're studying ecology in this unit, so just as a refresher, remember ecology is the study of organism interactions, or another way to think about it is the study of relationships between different things, different organisms. We started last chapter just talking about just organisms, but this one we're actually going to talk about populations, which is a whole bunch of organisms of the same species in the same area. What's very important and what we're going to learn this lesson is how are populations structured? Are they structured, how are they clumped together? And also how are populations affected by the environment? So if you have a population, it's growing, it's thriving, how does the environment affect that? So let's look at first, here's a little bit of an outline of what we're going through. Really the topic is how do populations grow? We're going to talk about the theory, how populations are supposed to grow. Then we'll get into the reality, how they actually grow. And then we'll do a case study about the human population, which is probably the most critical case that we need to study in terms of population growth because it's the whole reason why it's ruining the planet. So let's look first at the theory and the reality. So the theory is that, first of all, a population grows out of one of two ways. One, a new organism is born, or one immigrates. So in this picture you see birds, they can either immigrate or they can be born. And they can leave a population, or a population shrinks when a bird dies, or any organism dies, or it leaves, which is called emigration. Now, emigration and immigration, they're opposites of each other. So how do they grow? Over the long term, how do they grow? The first model is called exponential growth. So one of the things that you need to know is mathematically, how can you model how populations grow? So the growth of a population in this model continues indefinitely, which means it never stops. There's no resource limitation, which means think unlimited food, unlimited area, you can do whatever you want. Well, it's modeled by this formula. And those of you taking calculus, dn over dt means change in number over change in time. And in exponential growth, that's equal to r, the rate, the maximum rate, times the number of individuals that are there. So as the number of generations goes on, my population size skyrockets very fast. This is also known as a J-curve, or those of you that, again, remember in math, this is also called an exponential curve or quadratic, like x squared. This is when you have no resource limitations and a population grows forever. So if I just scroll up real quick, dn dt, again, dn means a change in number of individuals over change in time. R, as I told you, stands for rate, or the rate of increase, or how many offspring per individual in the population. So in this formula, dndt, change in number over time, times the rate. Now, if that rate, r, is a positive value, the population will continue to increase at an exponential rate. So as long as that r is positive, you're good. The higher the r, the faster it's going to increase. So if r is 1, it'll be even faster if r was 10, or if r was 100, it gets faster as r gets bigger. If r happens to be 0, that means the population doesn't increase or decrease. It doesn't grow, it doesn't shrink, it's just exactly the same. And if r is negative, like -5, -10, -0.1, the population decreases. So here's a graph that can help illustrate what I mean by that. Here the r is 1. See how it says 1n? That tells me that my population skyrockets again exponentially. This one's a little bit smaller, 0.5. So do you see how it grows like a little bit later? Like it takes about 10 generations, but it still has that exponential curve. It still has that J-curve that we were talking about. So even if that number is small, it still grows exponentially, as long as it's positive. Model number 2, so if it's not exponential, it's called logistic. By logistic, we're talking about the population that we're studying has some sort of resource limitations. Maybe there's, it's an island, so there's space issues. Or maybe there's not enough food, so there's a limitation somewhere. I'm going to introduce to you a new variable. It's called K. K means carrying capacity. So the effect of K on R, remember rate, becomes greater as the number of people in the population approaches that carrying capacity. So some of you may not know or may not understand what carrying capacity is. It really just means how much people or how many organisms can one area hold. So here's a logistic growth, for example. This is it's a complicated table. We can go over in class if you want. But say, for example, here's the population size. So the population size was 25, 100, 250, whatever. And let's assume that the carrying capacity is 1,500. Let's just say the rate of increase is the same, 1. Now, if I took this fraction, the carrying capacity minus the amount of people over the carrying capacity, you see at the beginning how the numbers are still sort of close to it, like 0.98, 0.93, whatever. But as I get closer and closer to the carrying capacity of 1500, my number shrinks very fast. And you can see that in these two columns. My growth rates, you may notice, see how it grows really fast. But as I go over 750, my growth rate now shrinks, it goes down, it decreases. So I give you a new formula. dn dt equals r max n, which is exactly like exponential, except for multiply times k minus n over k, which means the carrying capacity. So you see how this is sort of like a J-curve at first, but then as I reach the capacity of my area, it sort of stops at this point. This little dashed line is called an asymptote, for those of you that take math, and then k is represented by the asymptote, or what's the capacity of that area. They also call this an S-curve. Okay? So here are two models of growth. Exponential growth, dn dt equals rn. In this case, r is 1, so you see a straight J-curve. If you have logistic growth, which is this k minus n over k, it starts off as a J-curve, but then slows down to an S-curve right when I hit my carrying capacity. So here's a comparison of exponential and logistic growth. Now, what's the reality? That's in theory how all populations should grow, right? Well, first of all, let's talk about how they're structured. Well, first of all, we can't really figure out how they structure them until we figure out how do you measure how big a population size is. So for example, if I think about how many people live in California, like how do you measure the population size for people? So for us, we do like surveys or the census, but for animals, like how do you number all the animals? First of all, it is difficult to estimate population size accurately. One of the ways they could do it is called mark and recapture. So it's a common method. What they do is capture and mark members of the population. Then they release them out in the wild. And then they recapture them and mark them. So for example, if I take the number of marked individuals and divide it by the total population size, it should be equal to the amount of recaptured marked individuals over like what was the total recaptured individuals. So essentially I'm sort of guesstimating how many people there are. So if I send out 5 dolphins, right? If I capture 5 dolphins and I mark them and then I do another recatch and I only get like, a little bit, it helps me sort of realize, or I can guesstimate how big the total population is. And in this case, even though I captured like only a little bit of dolphins, I can estimate the population's about 1,100. That's called mark and recapture. Populations can also be distributed in 3 different ways. One of them is called clumped. So you can see how in this tide pool, we have sea stars here. We got a whole bunch of different animals here, but they all clump together. That's how a population is distributed. Another way is called, if I could zoom out for you guys, it's called uniform. So if these dots represent organisms, you can see that in some strange way, our penguins are sort of arranged uniformly. And then there's random. Here's a field of some type of flower. But you can see that there's no real pattern here. So there's 3 ways in which a population can be structured. We've got clumped, we've got uniform, and we have random. Another way to study a population, these are all basically population, how to describe a population. We talked about the size, we talked about how it's distributed. This one's the demographics. Demographics is a study of a population's vital statistics and how they change over time. Demographic data can be arranged in tables. I'll show you those tables, or graphs. So we're talking about like what are the key statistics. When we talk about demographics for human population, we usually talk about gender, income, stuff like that, religion. So here's some ways that we could, it's not really important that you know what these tables mean, but just know that things can be organized in tables for demographics. So this one, we're talking about death rate and life expectancy, size of litters, proportion of females weaning a litter, number of females in a litter. So all these stuff is what you can do to describe demographic data. And lastly, a population can be categorized by types of survivorship. And you look at 1, 2, and 3 as types of survivorship. So again, when we talked about evolution and ways species try to get their genes to survive, we have three different methods. One way, like humans, is that we have a lot of survivors, okay? And then later on in life, we die. So maybe around 70s, 80s, the majority of the human population dies off around that age. And by 100 or a little bit after 100, pretty much all humans are dead by then. In converse, I don't know what this animal is, but think about animals that have lots of offspring, like cockroaches, ants, bees, stuff like that. They don't live very long. I don't know if you know this, but houseflies, they only live for like 3 days. But they have like a bajillion kids, so their lifespan is very, very short. But they have they survive because they have so many kids. And then we have here animals in between where they don't live very long, so to speak, like humans, but they also don't live very short, so they have a straight survivorship curve. So how do they grow? So let's look at our two theories. Remember exponential and logistic? So say for example this population of elephants, if nothing threatens them, right? Nobody's hunting them, there's no limit on food. This example of elephants from the 1900s to 1970 is a straight exponential growth curve. Looks like a J, and every year it sort of like doubled and doubled and doubled till, to the most part, it almost like grew without bounds. So we started at 0, and by 70 years later, you know, really quickly, we went from 1,000 in 1960 to 8,000 in the mid-60s. But logistic growth is much more common. This is the one that we see almost all the time. Typically, populations oscillate, or they stay around the carrying capacity. So here's a paramecium in a lab. So if you do a science experiment, you have a paramecium. They grow very fast, and they reproduce really fast. Except for when they reach the amount of space, like in a petri dish or a beaker, wherever you're holding this, once they run out of space, the amount of the population stops very quickly. This is an S-curve. Here's another one, Daphnia population in the lab, same sort of thing. They grow really fast, so they exponentially grow, and then once they hit, this one says 50 number of Daphnia per 50 milliliters, and it's in the lab. I assume that they run out of space, so they stop growing, the population stops growing. Third, how does evolution affect life history traits? You may be saying, oh, what's a life history trait? It's any trait that affects an organism's life table, and they're the costs and benefits of all adaptations. So we have two reproductive strategies, similarity, which means they produce a lot of offspring at once. We looked at a couple of examples like ants and roaches and bees. So that's a reproductive strategy, similarity. And then iteroparity, we're talking about produce a few offspring repeatedly. So this agave plant is simiparous, or represents similarity, which means it has lots of offspring just at one time. And elephants and all mammals, like us, are iteroparous, which means we have a few offspring repeatedly, different times during the year, or different times in our lifetime. Also, parental care, the number of babies varies inversely with the amount of parental care. So the more parental care you have, the less number of babies you tend to have. So here's a graph of kestrels, a bird. So in a reduced brood size, okay, parents surviving the following winter. So in an enlarged or reduced brood size, meaning like amount of kids. So you notice that in an enlarged brood size, like there's a lot of kids, not that many survive. We're talking about 50% females and about 25-30% males survive when there's a lot of kids. When there's very, very little kids, almost 100% of the females live, and over 80% of the males live. So we're talking about the parents really take care of the kids if there is not a lot of kids. Or another way to think about it for humans, if you don't have a lot of kids, you take care of each kid more carefully. Another way to talk about this is called R-selected and K-selected. So this is just another name for the exact same theory we've been talking about. R-selected means they select traits that maximize reproductive success at low population densities. So dandelions, again, bees, ants, roaches, things that reproduce a lot. They call that R-selected, or they get traits that allow them to reproduce very quickly and a lot of offspring. That is different from K-selected, which means they select for traits that maximize reproductive success at high population densities. So again, these are like mammals. We're talking about animals and organisms that don't reproduce a lot. So we're talking about a Brazil nut tree, or these Brazil nut trees in a seed pod. So you may notice that the traits that they have are very specific, so that they do live for a very long time, which is different than R selected. So that's that. And then how does the environment affect population growth? Well, a lot, really. So for example, what really affects it is what is the population density. If you don't know what density means, it's like how many people there are, how many organisms there are in a given space. So if you take, for example, the classroom, like everyone's happy if the class is small, like 10, 15 kids, everyone can breathe, everyone can have their own seats or whatever. But if the classroom becomes 40 or 50 kids, now no one's happy, the teacher's unhappy, so density is really a factor that determines population growth. When the population density is low, B is greater than M. So this is like another more variables. As a result, the population grows until the density reaches Q. So this is my density independent rate, M. Okay, and here's my density dependent birth rate, B. So as long as the density dependent birth rate is way higher than the death rate, the population grows. But once the population density is high, meaning that the density independent death rate is higher than the density dependent birth rate, the population is now going to shrink. So density has plays a big role in whether the population lives or not, or grows really fast. So for example, here's we're talking about sheep, an example of sheep. So percent of sheep producing lambs. So when the population was small, like 200, 300, 400, they produced a lot of lambs. But once the population got over 400, over 500, near 600, you notice that sheep didn't produce that many lambs once the population was very large. That's called, again, density affecting the population growth. Here's another example. This is called a predator and prey model. So you notice that when there's a lot of hare, which is like a bunny, and lynx, their populations go back and forth. So here, notice that the hare, like the bunny, it had a ton of organisms, right? Over 150,000 hares were existing. Well, when that happens, that means the lynx has a lot of food. So the lynx eat all the hare, and their population grows. And when their population grows and eat all the hare, then the hare's population drops. When the hare's population drops, that means that the lynx have nothing to eat, so their population drops. If their population drops, then the hare grow again, which means the lynx grow again, which means the hare shrinks, which means the lynx shrinks, etc., etc., etc. I think you get the pattern. That's another example of density-dependent regulation. So we're talking about competition as a density-dependent, predation, like what we just talked about with the hare and the lynx, waste accumulation, territoriality, so all instances of density being a factor, intrinsic factors, it's not very important, we'll talk about that in class, and then disease. So disease spreads really fast if the density is very high. And lastly, what we're going to talk about is human population growth. It is the underlying root of all anthropogenic ecological problems. So ultimately, the real problem with the world and the environment, like why everything is getting destroyed, is all traced to one singular problem. Our population growth as humans is growing way out of control. So first of all, the human population has been in a period of accelerated exponential growth since the Industrial Revolution. That growth rate is slowing. So for example, in this little picture, you may notice at 8,000 BCE to about 1,000 BCE in the plague, we've had a very stable population growth, way less than 500 million. But since the since about, again, the Industrial Revolution, the mid-1500s, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, we've been growing exponentially, whereas in the middle of the 1,000 and 2,000 years, we were just barely halfway of a billion. Now we are over, I don't know if you guys have studied the news, but we just passed 7 billion people on the Earth. I don't know how our Earth is going to handle it. So here's another picture. Even though we're growing exponentially, our growth rate is actually slowing down. We're not growing as fast anymore. But still, since the R is positive, we're still growing exponentially. So I want to show you guys a video real quick if you guys can watch this video. This is a video, a time lapse, essentially showing you how the population has grown over the last few years.
1 AD to the present. and then projected to the year 2020. Population totals and locations are indicated by dots, each of which represents 1 million people. Historic reference points are provided by the images on the right.
So you may notice what they're going to do is on this bottom left corner, they're going to talk about what year we are in. They're going to talk about what important event is going on. And they're going to put a dot on the map for every million people there are in a certain location. So watch for me real quick how fast the human population has grown. So you see it's sort of slow, nothing's really happening. We're in the year 200s. We're now in the 600s, still growing, but nothing really shocking yet. The Middle Ages now, 1100s. Starting to see some growth in Europe and China and India. Now we're talking about Industrial Revolution, advent of electricity. So that's 2020. Question is, you know, where do we go from here? Like, what's next? What are we gonna do with the human population now? Like, we went through like over 2,000 years where there was like nothing, and now in the last only like 100 years, this whole thing turned yellow. Now what do we do? So now, first of all, also you should notice that growth rate is not uniform across the globe. So even though that the growth rate of the whole globe is growing really fast, it's not the same everywhere. These are called age structure pyramids. What they do is they categorize each age range, as you can see right here, and they pull out a bar, both female and male, representing what percent of the population represents that gender and that age. If you have a pyramid that has the bottom way bigger than the top, we're talking about rapid growth. An example is Afghanistan. If you have an age structure diagram, which is sort of, I guess you could say it's sort of rectangular, it's not like a pyramid, we're talking about no growth like Italy. And then if it sort of flattens itself out even more, the bottom is still a little bit bigger than the top. So this one, see how I have like this little glut in the middle, and then like I have small at the top and small at the bottom? That's telling me there's no growth. In this one, I have a pyramid that sort of has a wide base. It's wider than this one. So this is like slow growth to no growth, like the United States. As countries industrialize, various changes in demographics occur. The demographic transition. So once you're the demographic transition refers to that population growth changes as countries industrialize. So this is infant mortality, like how many deaths there are per 1,000 births. If you're in an industrialized country, they barely have any. You know, we're looking at about 5 per 1,000 infants die. But for less industrialized countries, we're talking about 50 or over 50 per 1,000 births are dying. However, life expectancy, if you're in an industrialized country, you're expected to live like to almost 80. In less industrialized countries, you barely live past 60. And really, as of yet, we really don't know what the human global capacity is. So we're talking about, you know, here's energy, gigajoules of like what the country is using in terms of power and electricity. What happens when we get too much? I mean, we just passed 7 billion. Who knows what's next for us? So that is population dynamics. Here are the standards I wrote at the top of your notes, so you don't have to copy this down, but you should know in this chapter how populations are mathematically modeled. I told you the equations. The relationships among all terms in population models, so we talked about logistic and exponential models. Ideal populations, which is like exponential, and real-world populations, which is like logistic. You should explain patterns of life history, distribution, and survivorship. The costs and benefits of characteristic adaptations and strategies, so K strategist versus R strategist, or lots of offspring versus little offspring. You should know what the cost and benefit of both of them is. And then you should be able to describe what are the trends historically and currently about human population. So I know this is a little of a longer video, but I'm trying to go through a chapter a day. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. Until then, see you in class. Take care.